Thank you for the songs. We are going to Matthew chapter 27, continuing through the Gospel of Matthew. This is now message number 72, entitled, Made a Fool. We'll be looking at Matthew chapter 27, verses 27 to 31. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe. When they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. And after that they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put on his own raiment on him and led him away to crucify him. 20 years ago now, in early 2004, the movie The Passion of the Christ was released. It was commercially very successful, but it was also very controversial. And the controversy mainly centered around the extremely graphic violence of, particularly of the scourging scene of Jesus. Those who criticized the movie expressed concern that some viewers may not be able to handle such extended and graphic violence. And the response to this actually was to release an edited version the next year, and mostly the only editing that was done was toning down of the scourging scene, taking out some of what were deemed the most graphic parts of that scene. Those who praised the movie, on the other hand, considered it an unflinching, realistic portrayal of the brutality that Jesus suffered. Now, outside of some historical records about such proceedings, and there are some records about such things, we don't really know the graphic details of what happened to Jesus that day. The Bible states very clearly that he was scourged, that he was beaten, that he was mocked. We do know historically that those beatings were so brutal that many of those that had been condemned and suffered them didn't survive the ordeal in order to make it to crucifixion. But we don't know the graphic details about the scene. Many preachers, many commentators, many writers throughout history have gone to great lengths to fill in those details for us, but really they're mostly speculating because the Bible doesn't give us that sort of detail. And so that raises a question. Is it important that we know exactly in graphic detail what happened that day? Or is the better question to ask about what happened that day, why did it happen? Why was Jesus beaten? Why was Jesus scourged? Why was Jesus mocked? In other words, what's the significance of it, and what of the Old Testament was fulfilled by it? And so that question of why is what we will consider in this message. Now, chapter 27 opened up with the dawn of the 15th Nisan. This is the morning after the Passover would have been eaten that evening, on the evening of the 15th of Nisan. The Sanhedrin had rendered their official verdict, and they sent Jesus to Pilate for execution. And Matthew records the reaction of Judas to the condemnation of Jesus when he was sent to Pilate. And throughout this account, Matthew gave three witnesses to Jesus' innocence. But despite that, his trial and his path to crucifixion continued to proceed. Now, Pilate took a few different measures to sort of pass off responsibility, but ultimately he did turn him over for crucifixion. And so as we look at these verses 27 to 31, this is just a brief description of the soldiers taking Jesus to the judgment hall before crucifying him. Now, of course, Pilate had him scourged, most likely with what is known as the cat of nine tails, beaten and with that whip, and he was handed over, and then the soldiers mocked him and hit him, and that's what we see in this brief description. So we're going to look at this in two parts. First of all, we're going to look at verses 27 to 31, the mocking of Jesus. And then secondly, we're going to consider the significance. What is it that is important about the mocking and the beating of Jesus, other than the fact that it occurred, other than the fact that it would have been brutal, it would have been bloody, it would have been gruesome. No doubt it would have been a sickening sight to see on many different levels. But beyond that, what is the significance of Jesus being beaten and treated in this way? So we'll start out by looking at the passage, verses 27 to 31, and the mocking of Jesus. And just as a reminder, verse 26, just prior to this, says, "Then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified." So as we begin with verse 27, the decision of the crowd has been made. They have asked for Barabbas to be released and for Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate has him scourged, has him whipped, has him beaten with again, most likely what we refer to as the cat of nine tails, and then hands him over to the soldiers for crucifixion. So that's where we pick up with verse 27. "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers." Now, this common hall that is referred to, it is a part of the palace. Recall that it would have been more some sort of a courtyard where Pilate had made offer of Barabbas or Jesus to the crowd of Jews that had gathered there. But this common hall would be a place inside in the interior of the place. This, no doubt, probably a reference to the former palace of Herod the Great. And this reference to the whole band refers to the cohort of soldiers that were stationed there at the temple annex. And an entire cohort would have been 600 soldiers, 1/10 of a Roman legion. But that doesn't mean that all 600 were present at that time or at any particular given time. But the phrase is saying that all those who were there were gathered to the hall where they took Jesus. And probably most likely could have been a couple hundred of them at least. But we really don't have any idea of what the actual number of the soldiers. But it was all of those that were there, that were on hand at that time. Verse number 28. "And they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe." They removed Jesus' outer robe, his cloak or outer garment, and they put on him this scarlet or purple robe. And the word that's actually used for robe here that they put on him is actually a word that indicates a short military style cloak. And so this was probably something of one of the soldiers, something that they had on hand. That's obviously they were using whatever things that they had at hand. And the collar would have been sort of to approximate the royal robes that a king would wear, as ultimately their goal was to mock him as a king of the Jews. Verse number 29. "And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it up on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' So they wove together a crown from some sort of briary sticks that they had. They took this stick, this reed, they put it in his hand to again mock a crown that a king would wear, to mock a royal scepter that a king might hold. And they're mocking Jesus as they bow before him. They're hailing him as the king of the Jews. They've sort of set Jesus up in this scene, and they're acting like the servants that are honoring their royal king. And in verse number 30, and they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. So they then spit on him. They hit him on the head with this reed. It probably would have been about like taking a broom handle or something and whacking somebody pretty hard on the head with it. No doubt it would have been very painful. Spitting, just treating with the utmost of indignity. And of course, this is not the first time he suffers this multiple times, beginning back at the house of Caiaphas, according to the record that we have. And then verse 31 says, and after that they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him and led him away to crucify him. And so when they finished, or maybe they just grew tired of the mocking, they put his own outer robe back on him and led him away. So this began his walk to Golgotha, and that's what we'll read about in the next message and section of the chapter as we move toward this crucifixion and this scene upon this cross. So it's quite a brief description of this time with the soldiers. Really, nothing extremely graphic that is told to us here. And so that brings us to sort of the real meat of what we want to consider about this passage, and that's what's so significant about this is we know that, for instance, that it was the Roman custom that they would subject those that had been condemned to death by execution, by crucifixion. They would subject them to the most humiliation and torture and indignity that they could possibly suffer. On the one hand, it was a sentence that was left for the very worst, lowest sort of criminals. And they were also doing this as sort of a preventive measure so that others would see the fate that would await those that would betray the Roman Empire and such, and become guilty of such a beating. So on the one hand, we know that this wasn't unusual in the sense that these soldiers are doing something that they weren't used to doing. This is something that was common that would take place. Now, of course, it was a particular feature here that they dress him up as a king and sort of mock him in worship and such. Now, prior to Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, he had actually predicted this very scene. In Matthew chapter 20, verses 18 and 19, Jesus said, "Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify him, and the third day he shall rise again." Now, again, this is the words that Jesus spoke just before that, sometimes what we refer to as the triumphal entry into Jerusalem in great detail. So obviously the words of Jesus, the prophecy that he gave of his own death, well, those are being fulfilled in these actions by these Gentiles, the soldiers of the Roman Empire, the soldiers of the governor Pilate. But it also fulfills Old Testament prophecy in a place like Isaiah chapter 50 and verse number 6 about that servant of Yahweh. "I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting." And we can actually turn to some other passages in the Old Testament that seem to be making reference to this event as well. So on the one hand, we can say that there's significance in this event because Jesus had predicted this very thing would take place. The Old Testament had predicted this concerning the sufferings of the Messiah. But again, we're still left with that question of why. Why did Jesus have to be beaten and to be mocked? I mean, isn't it enough that he's going to death on the cross? And when we think about the Last Supper, when Jesus was in the upper room, he talked about the shedding of his blood for the forgiveness of sins. And ultimately, he's talking about his death on the cross that makes atonement. And so obviously we see the significance of the death on the cross as the sacrifice, the execution that comes on Jesus, fulfilling Old Testament prophecies like Psalm 22 and other places. But why did Jesus have to be beaten and mocked and treated this way? Again, Matthew has continued to emphasize that these are not just random events. This is not just a sad, tragic tale of things that befell Jesus, but rather these are things that must be. All of these things must be fulfilled in order for the purpose of God to be fulfilled. Well, if we think about the Old Covenant law, for instance, and we think about what the Old Covenant law had to say about beating, there was a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 2 and 3, about what would happen to the disobedient. And it reads, "And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by certain number. 40 stripes he may give him and not exceed, lest if he should exceed and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee." So for those disobedient, those transgressors of the law, there were actually many different situations that would call for the offender to be beaten in this way. 40 stripes, and of course, it became customary among the Jews for the 49 stripes to actually be 39, or the 40 stripes to be 39, rather. In other words, they didn't want to risk going over or being excessive. We know that Paul himself received some such beatings at the hands of the Jews. And so this is a penalty according to the Old Covenant law for a transgressor, for one that broke the law, one that was disobedient, one that was wicked and unrighteous, to be beaten. And then we think about this scene and the repeated reference of the mocking of Jesus that is taking place. And there's actually prophecy concerning the Messiah that he would be mocked as a part of his sufferings. And there's a wonderful psalm, Psalm 69, a wonderful messianic prophecy. We studied it quite a while back. But there are a number of places in Psalm 69 that actually refer to specific events pertaining to the crucifixion of Jesus. I'm just going to read a few verses here. Psalm 69, verse 7. "Because for thy sake I have borne reproach, shame hath covered my face." Psalm 69, 9. "For the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproached thee are fallen upon me." Psalm 69, 11. "I made sackcloth also my garment, and I became a proverb unto them." In other words, to become a proverb is to become a gazing stock or a laughing stock. It's to become a fool. In essence, it is to be mocked. Psalm 69, verses 19 and 20. "Thou hast known my reproach and my shame and my dishonor. Mine adversaries are all before thee. Reproach hath broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. And I looked for some to take pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none." Again, it's a great psalm. If you go back and read it, and you continue reading on to the end, you find that ultimately deliverance comes for this righteous sufferer. And that deliverance is actually the salvation of Zion. But these are just some specific parts of this psalm that I referred to that refers to the mocking of Jesus, the reproaches that were put upon him, the being made a proverb or a parable. So think about this scene that we've just read about, even though it's a brief description. Think about what has taken place here. They dress Jesus up. They take this soldier's outer tunic and put on him, mainly for the coloring of it, that it would sort of mimic that of some royal attire. They take a crown, not of gold, not even a laurel that was given to the winners and those honored in the games, but they take a crown fashioned from the brambles and the briars and put it upon his head. They take a reed, a stick, essentially, and put this in his hand. What were they doing when they're doing all of this? They're making Jesus out to be a fool so that they can laugh and mock and scorn and heap all manner of indignity on him. So Jesus, in this very scene, is being made a fool. And if we think about the book of Proverbs, for instance, what does it tell us about the beating of a fool? It tells us that the rod is for the back of fools. It is, in other words, it is as natural as putting the bit and bridle on a horse in order to be able to control it and to direct it. In other words, the fools call for it. Proverbs 10:13, in the lips of him that hath understanding, wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that's void of understanding. Proverbs 18:6, a fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calleth for strokes, for the beating with a rod. Proverbs 19:29, judgments are prepared for scorners, and stripes for the backs of fools. Proverbs 26:3, a whip for the horse and a bridle for the ass and a rod for the fool's back. Now, when we think about the book of Proverbs, we don't usually think about a gospel-rich book. We don't usually think about a prophetically significant book. And probably one of the great shames that has happened among Christianity over the last many years is that we've taken the book of Proverbs and simply made it a how-to manual of life hacks. How to do better at business, how to save money, how to grow rich, how to get along with your husband and wife, and all of these kind of things. And Proverbs is just chock full of wisdom. But what is that book about? Why is it given to us? Proverbs is about giving wisdom instruction to a son so that he will be a wise king. That's what the book of Proverbs is actually about. And as you go through the book of Proverbs, you're going to find a continual comparison and contrasting of wise sons and sons who are fools. A wise son is one that listens to his father's instruction and he keeps it. It's right from the very start. Proverbs 1:8, Proverbs 2:1, Proverbs 3:1. I can go on and on. I'm not going to give all the list of all these verses. A foolish son, on the other hand, is a burden to his mother and is a despiser of her as well. A wise son is one who not only listens to the instruction of his father, but he receives correction. He's corrected by the words of his father, and his life, his attitude, his behavior, these things are corrected. A foolish son, on the other hand, is one that scorns correction. It angers him, doesn't want to be corrected, makes him even more bent on going his own way. That's a fool of a son. Proverbs 13:1. A wise son, we are told, is one that makes his father glad, is a source of blessing to his parents. On the other hand, a foolish son is one that causes shame. Proverbs 17:2. One that is a heavy grief to his father and bitterness to his mother. Proverbs 17:25. Is actually a calamity to his father in Proverbs 19:13, and a great waster of his family's resources in Proverbs 19:26. A wise son is one that doesn't go in the way of sinners. In other words, he doesn't follow after the multitude that is walking in the wrong way. A foolish son, on the other hand, is a great companion of those. Proverbs 28:7. The wise son is one who ultimately will be rewarded. He will be ornamented with grace. He'll find the knowledge of God. He will be guided and kept, finding life and peace, and be blessed of the Lord. But a foolish son is one who will get a rod of punishment. Proverbs 22:15. Proverbs 23, verses 13 and 14. Proverbs 29:15. Proverbs 10:13. Proverbs 26:3. And he's one who ultimately will be cursed by the Lord. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 33 to 35. Think about some of these words. Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. Proverbs 23, verses 13 to 14. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, and thou shalt deliver his soul from hell. Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. Well, according to the Old Covenant law, a disobedient son, a rebellious son, is one who was to be beaten with a rod. But an incorrigible son, one who was obstinate, refused all correction, continued to go in his own rebellious way, he was to be put to death, according to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 to 21. The significance of the beating of Jesus Christ is that though Jesus is a wise son, one whom the Father spoke on different occasions from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Even though Jesus is a wise son, he was mocked, he was beaten, and he suffered as a fool, so that fools could be forgiven. Fools could be blessed with the rewards due to wise sons and daughters. When we think about the sufferings of Jesus, it really is nothing but what my sin deserves. It's nothing but what your sin deserves. Now, I'm not saying that the wounds of Jesus were insignificant at all. But even if we had a complete medical report that breaks down for us every abrasion and laceration and contusion and gives us all of this information, you could read that report frontwards, backwards, and you would not find the significance of why this had to happen contained in those details. If we had an expert in ancient torture. And that expert could describe for us in graphic detail the process of scourging and what the experience felt like and what it looked like and what the results would have been. We still wouldn't find the significance of what happened there. But if we look at the Old Covenant law concerning stubborn and rebellious and incorrigible sons, we do find significance. Again, they were ultimately to be put to death. And do you know what the word says immediately after that? This is Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. Another passage that we're told fulfilled in the death of Jesus Christ. So if we look at the prophets and the prophecies of the Messiah, we look at books like the Psalms and Proverbs, and we look at especially what Proverbs has to say concerning foolish sons and what they deserve, then that is where we find the significance. That's where we find the importance of what took place that day. If we understand God's word teaches us that we are all born sinful fools. We're all born that way, sinful fools. Then we understand that Jesus took the beating of a fool. That means he took our beatings, that we might become wise children and inherit blessings from the Father through faith. All right, that's all of the message for this morning. We'll conclude with a hymn.